Welcome to another episode of WeedBudz Radio and WeedBudz TV. We have some amazing guests joining me today because what we're going to talk about really deep dive into drying systems and how small businesses can participate and afford equipment like this. We know that it's useful, but I want to jump right into introductions, and I'm going to start with Shawna. Shawna, if you don't mind introducing yourself, what have you been, some of the fun projects you've been working on in the industry on both the cannabis and hemp side? And we're going to kind of go from there and do introductions. And we have Matt and Tim joining us today as well. And so really excited about the amazing experts that we have around us today. So Shawna, thank you so much for joining WeedBudz.
Perfect. Thanks for having us on, Ryan. Thanks for, getting us off on the right foot. My name's Shawna Koch. I'm a business development manager at IEC Thermo. So what that is I basically help with the sales and marketing team. I do a lot of trade shows, kind of that area. My experience actually comes from Washington State's adult use program, otherwise known as I-502. So I started in administration and safety. I helped manage 4 different facilities across the state of Washington. And I also dabbled a little bit in safety and compliance, and Matthew will touch in a little bit on that. That's actually where I met Matthew, was working in that administrative safety space in the recreational or adult use cannabis market. I was also in charge of the drying, curing, and all traceability of over 120,000 square foot canopy and constant production, which is about 2 3/4 acres, actually. I learned that recently. So that was in constant production. So every 2 weeks I was harvesting about 2,000 or 3,000 plants, hanging them for 2 weeks, and then curing them as well. So I'm pretty well versed on the drying and curing side of cannabis. And I brought that experience and that knowledge to the hemp space, which, definitely prepared me for my position at IEC Thermo, which does specialize in American-made hemp dryers. So, cannabis drying, hemp drying, definitely related, but definitely different too. And we'll get into some of those differences a little bit later.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And what a great segue. Matt, if you don't mind kind of sharing some of your background and expertise with us.
Yeah, sure. And like Shawna said, thanks for having us on. My name is Matthew Clark, and I also got into the industry in Washington State in I-502, or the adult use market. First opening up a retail store and then moving on to a 30,000 square foot grow that was eventually became part of the larger grow operation that Shawna and I met at. And in that position, I became the director of administration, and then sort of ended up in charge of safety and some other things. So really opened my eyes to a lot of different parts of the industry that I hadn't necessarily thought about when I first got into it, coming out to open up a little retail store. So it's been really interesting. And now, being able to bring that experience over to the hemp space, which is obviously seeing a lot of explosion. But it's really interesting to be part of this problem of the scale and, the size of the industry, and having gotten to see a lot of different things on the adult use side and being able to bring some of that experience over to what's happening in hemp.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining today and lending some of your expertise. And I want to jump over, and the man that made this all possible, Tim, thank you so much for connecting with me and helping to bring such an amazing lineup for today's episode.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Rye. I'm complimented by some folks that have a deep experience, right, in the cannabis and hemp space. And I bring to the table some experience in the pharmaceutical, molecular diagnostics, and healthcare software. Somewhat unrelated, but then there are crossover with regards to FDA regulation and guidance. And then also brings some thoughtful business strategy, business development, channel partners, strategic relationships. Because what we're seeing in the marketplace and what we believe is that we're not just selling dryers. We're advising in terms of how to best process that. And that looks like a supply chain, right? And that's that vertical integration, which we often so hear much about. Nonetheless, complemented again by Matthew and Shawna and their passion, right, for the cannabis and hemp space, which adds so much excitement, right, to this marketplace. So I think complementary disciplines are really beneficial for all concerned. And hey, just really helpful to be here and hopefully help your listeners make some informed decisions.
That's incredible, because we know that there's so many aspects to
Yeah.
drying and where it fits into, as you mentioned, the supply chain of how do we grow these amazing plants and then take them to the marketplace in so many different forms, which leads me to a kind of, for me, it might be fundamental, Shawna, but is there a big difference between drying hemp and drying cannabis?
That's a great question. So ultimately, the drying process is stabilization. That's how we like to think about it. Drying equals stabilization. So it's a very important part of the process, but it's just that. It's a part of that overall process. Like Tim said, that supply chain. In terms of drying cannabis, usually it's on a lot smaller scale. Typically, we're dealing with hundreds of pounds of product at a time. Very manual, a lot of hands-on manual labor involved in that drying process. Typically, you would harvest your plant, hang it upside down for about 2 weeks, and then you would bin it or store it, and then begin that curing process. So again, that's a lot smaller scale. That's typically also in batches. So you would do one batch followed by another batch. So not necessarily a continuous process. Like I said, hang drying takes a lot of time, takes up to about 2 weeks. And that's just the drying part. That's not even the curing part. It also can be inconsistent. It depends where your fans are. Cannabis drying revolves around airflow and air circulation. So you're constantly manipulating that airflow, making sure you're getting a consistent product. So if you leave your fans in one room for too long, maybe the product around those fans are super crispy and over dried, where a product that was a little bit further from the fans may still be wet. So it's very hard to get consistent drying through cannabis or through that cannabis drying methods. The hemp drying is a lot larger scale just because we are dealing with considerable acreage. So we would be dealing with thousands of pounds at a time or tons. It does tend to be a lot more automated or continuous flow, like I said, minimal handling. A lot of the hemp space is gearing a lot more towards automation, just dealing with the sheer scale of the industry. And then hemp drying also is typically mechanical. It does depend a lot on what your end product is. So if you were going for, say, smokable hemp flower, you maybe wouldn't use a mechanical drying. But if you were going for, say, CBD biomass or topicals or tinctures or anything kind of in that extraction realm, mechanical is the way to do it at scale. Degradation does begin almost immediately after harvest, whether that's cannabis or hemp. So you want to get that product dried or stabilized, like I said, as early as possible, as fast as possible, and as efficient as possible with minimal handling. So you're kind of walking that fine line between getting it done and getting it done now, but getting it done right and being very deliberate in your process. So I think the ultimate, what it comes down to, the differences is the scale. Cannabis is a lot smaller scale, so we can get away with doing it by hand. Whereas the hemp space is just, the scale is pretty unmanageable compared to cannabis.
So you'd mentioned curing, and I apologize. I don't have a lot of experience in really, what is curing and in defining that. And so I don't want to be the one to kind of explain that to the audience. Shawna, do you mind kind of telling us, what is curing, when and where is it applicable?
Yeah, absolutely. So curing is definitely an important part of the process. What curing does is it balances and it stabilizes your product and the compounds within it. So the cannabinoids and the terpenes, it stabilizes that. And that's what gives cannabis its smell, its taste, and honestly, its effect sometimes. So if you ever open a package of cannabis and it smells like hay, that's something that had been, cured incorrectly. Curing typically occurs after the drying process, and curing is almost exclusively for something smokable. So you wouldn't cure something that's going for extraction, something that's going for fiber, but something that will be a smokable flower, you would want to cure. And that process, again, takes about another 2 weeks. So keep in mind, you've got your 2-week drying window, and then you usually have about a 2-week curing window as well. And what that does is that helps to off-gas your product. So after it's dry and stabilized, I would put my product into a sealed bag, and then every day or every 2 days or whatever that looks like, I would open that up and off gas it, letting the compounds and the chemicals release from that product, getting rid of that green smell or that green taste, that chlorophyll. Curing helps to get rid of that and really stabilize that product, make it smell good, make it taste good. Yeah, Matthew, did you have anything to add? He's cured quite a bit of cannabis in
Well,
his days.
I was gonna say you really sort of, nailed it. And that's understanding that, as soon as you cut that plant, you're starting a chemical process, and that process continues for quite a while. And so removing the moisture, that's the drying process, and that's how you avoid things like mold and stuff happening. But then the curing is that continued process of allowing those gases to continue to off-put. If you don't, like Shawna said, that's when you end up with a lot of stuff that tends to smell more like hay, because those gases just sort of were trapped in there. So that is why, especially if you're looking for a smokable product, or maybe some higher end hashes or things like that, where you're going to take some time to try to develop it. But generally speaking, yeah, curing is something you're really going to put the time into for the product that you're trying to produce.
That makes perfect sense. Every aspect of this industry and every aspect of the supply chain, I feel, has so many regulations and different laws that we need to really be aware of and figure out how to best navigate. And Matt, I know that's kind of more your focus. And so for anybody kind of looking at dryers, full drying systems, is there anything that they should be really concerned with and really taking a deep dive into before they get started?
Well, I think the most important thing is to kind of look at it. What is the end product that you're trying to produce, and what is the quality of that? Looking forward, and I think something we see more in hemp, is people understanding that they're eventually going to have an FDA-approved product. There's a few different ways to go about doing that. And so deciding early in the process if you're going to do something like pharmaceutical grade as your end goal, then you're going to create a different kind of facility that's going to take a certain kind of investment to create the standards that you'll need to make that. If you're trying to create a food grade product, those standards are a little bit different. So it's really worth the time to try to research and think about, what are your end products? If it costs me this much to create a pharmaceutical product, what's going to be the return on that? Is it worth that investment? Same kind of thing with food grade or other products that you might be thinking about, animal feed, different things. So if your path is some kind of FDA or government program product, you're going to want to think about that as early as possible, so that you can start to incorporate what they call good manufacturing practices that are going to, set you up for that audit process. So as far as, particular laws, it's always going to really depend on your jurisdiction. So there's usually permitting involved in a project like ours. It's going to require, some electrical and plumbing and those kind of things. So we certainly work with folks to try to get them the information that we need, but we definitely find that there's enough of a variation that it's not necessarily a standard model. But like I said, it's more about kind of looking to the future a little bit and understanding that that there's a lot more rules coming. That's one of the unfortunate side effects of legalization, is that there's going to be a lot more regulation. I was at a trade show last October in Las Vegas, where for the first time a federal official and an EPA regional director spoke at a cannabis or hemp conference. But that was his primary message. We're happy to have you here. Welcome to the party, but that means there's more rules coming. So just think about it that way. So you don't have to try to spend the money later to catch up. I unfortunately feel like the adult use is, because there hasn't been a lot of consideration that they were going to go into a federally approved product, people haven't made that investment. And so a lot of facilities, they're not really GMP. It's kind of more what I describe as Home Depot.
Right.
And that applies to even a lot of bigger brands that you might know. And it's because they sort of had a blind spot. It's only within the hemp space that people are sort of laser focused on CBD and that pathway to, the drink lines and the big products. And so they have a real awareness of that. So that's what I would definitely focus on in terms of regulation.
That's awesome. Thank you. And Shawna, are there any consequences to inadequately drying? If somebody makes a mistake in the drying process, what happens?
Oh, absolutely. The most common one would be mold. Like we said, degradation and mold do set in almost immediately after harvest. So we have seen quite a few issues with mold. Even people that think that they've tried, they get it to down to 15% on the other side. If you're not putting it into, say, climate controlled storage, we have actually seen product rehydrate and then mold. So people are there thinking your product is stable, it's all good. Meanwhile, that chemical breakdown is still happening. So mold would be a big one. We've seen that a little bit. I think a perfect example would be bales on the hemp side. We heard last year from a lot of the bigger baling companies, yeah, just bale it, wrap it with plastic, it'll last forever, it's all good, get out of jail free card. And so a lot of people did that, unfortunately, and a couple months down the road when they started popping those bales open, and it's just moldy mush on the inside. A couple people had to do some pretty serious game day decisions. So we like to say, stabilize it, dry it as fast as possible, get it out of the field, through a dryer, and then once it's stabilized and in storage, you can sit on it for a little bit. I don't recommend sitting on it for 6 months or so. What I recommend doing is getting all the way through that process down to crude. Once you've extracted it to a crude oil, that has a considerably longer shelf life. So that's my recommendation. Get your stuff dried and stabilized as fast as possible, and then you can kind of have some wiggle room or some breathing room to determine your next steps if you haven't already. That's why Matthew and I, and IEC in general, does like to preach working backwards, figuring out what your end goal is, and then, filling in the steps that way, as opposed to kind of building the airplane while you fly it, is the analogy that we like to use.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would just sort of add that, excuse me, I mean, people need to make sure that they're matching up the different processes. And so people underestimating things like harvest and how much time that's going to take them, even on what a lot of hemp growers consider to be a small operation, like 10 acres, that's still going to take a considerable amount of time and space if you don't have some kind of a good plan to dry it. And that's where a lot of people sort of find themselves in the fall, suddenly realizing that they have a real issue, and that, there was a huge increase in planting last year in hemp, but they say only 50% of that even made it out of the field, which means people spent money to grow it and then they had to till it under. And so, it's really important that you don't underestimate any particular part of the supply chain, or it can have some real consequences.
That's a
That
great
makes
point,
sense.
Matthew. Absolutely. Yep. That kind of continuous flow that we like to talk about. If you're going to put something into the ground, please, please, please have a plan on how you're going to get it out of the ground. We got a lot of calls last year, help me, I've got 400 acres in the ground. I'm going to harvest it next week. How do I dry it? Buddy, how are you going to dry it? That's a good question. Should have thought about that 6 months ago before you put 400 acres in the ground. So definitely have an exit strategy. We've got customers this year that are signing contracts to have their stuff dried before they put it into the ground. They have that exit strategy. And I actually have a customer who refused to put seeds in the ground until he had that dryer. He told his bosses, you guys, I'm not putting this in the ground. I'm not spending your money. I'm not spending my time if we're not going to see a return on this. So really having that entire plan kind of fleshed out and even signed, contracts signed, if you have the ability to do so.
That makes perfect sense. And thank you for that. And really, looking at the business of this, I know that drying systems are not inexpensive. And so, Tim, do you mind kind of explaining, what is the pricing for systems like this, and how might we participate, in terms of working together to buy a drying system?
Sure. And I think the key word is participation. And as Shawna and Matthew have stated, begin with the end in mind. But we always say on the sales side, tell us about your dream, and then let's work backwards. Because we want to help them really make an informed decision about the entire vertical integration process. And that is eight different touch points. So if you think about just a dryer, you have things on the pre-drying side, right? You have maybe a hammer mill, you have a harvester that's prepping the actual product before it gets to the dryer. And then there's post-drying in terms of classification, sorter, et cetera, in terms of additional equipment. So when we're talking and speaking and engaging with potential clients, we're taking a holistic approach. So it's just not the dryer to consider, it's the other components that complement the drying system. The second piece is this. We know that farmers are the bedrock, right, of this industry. And there's a lot of influencers and potential entries into the marketplace that are not farmers, but we build our product based upon the farmer and the outcomes. And what does that mean in terms of drying and drying capacity? There's challenges, right? It's a new burgeoning industry, so there isn't drying capacity that fulfill the existing and potential future needs. So when a farmer is challenged with, hey, where do I get my product dried? We look at perhaps the toll drying method, right? And or the model. So that's where not every farmer buys a dryer, but rather maybe he or she contracts with a farmer in a given geography, kind of like a co-op model, right, in terms of being able to access that drying capacity. So we could talk about dryers, but we also want to be thoughtful of drying capacity in a given geography. And, relative to price, we like to take a step back and say, hey, before we get to that, what are you trying to achieve? What do you currently have in your barn and or building? Do you have that building actually spec'd out? So we advise, as much as we're talking about dryers, right, we're advising about the whole supply chain system to ensure that before they get to the decision of the dryer, they understand all the costs, right, and ramifications of making those investments. Does it make sense?
That makes perfect sense. So in
Yeah,
terms oh, sorry, Matt, please.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, just kind of emphasize what Tim said. It's like I said before, if we aren't able to match up the capacities for the systems, then ultimately folks aren't going to be happy with our system because they're not getting the output that they want. So, we are large capacity. We can do a lot per hour. So you need to have a machine that'll bring that much hemp from the field, or you're going to have people standing around, So it's really important, for us to help people succeed to think about all those things.
That makes sense. And Shawna, if I'm a farmer and I'm really looking at ways to get in this, what types of questions do I need to be asking myself, or resources, so I don't overlook anything in the kind of purchasing process?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we've said it a couple of times, but the number one question that you should ask yourself is, what's my end goal? What's my end product? What's my desired product line? And that doesn't just have to be one product. You don't have to say, I'm going to make the best possible CBD oil, or, you know what I mean? You could have, your tinctures, you could have your smokable flower, you could have your fiber, you can have multiple end products coming from the same crop, but having that in mind. And that way you can work backwards, say, hey, I want to make tinctures. All right, I need extraction equipment. I need a dryer. I need to grow this many acres. Really just, being aware of what your end goal is. I would also say be very aware, especially in 2020, of what your particular state's laws are, laws and regulations. Some states just went with the USDA program. Some have written their own programs for 2020. So just kind of being aware of what your particular state's regulations are. And like Matthew said, hemp is a pretty regulated industry, meaning you can now do GMP, you can be certified organic. So kind of put on your future glasses and know the industry is heading towards pharmaceutical, it's heading towards food grade, and kind of know, I'm just going to start on this road knowing that this is where it's going, as opposed to going this way. Hey, not too many regulations. We can kind of be loosey-goosey. Oh, shoot, FDA stepped in. Now we need to course correct. So I think really trying to be ahead of the game in terms of, looking at the pharmaceutical industry and kind of seeing how they do things. Something I find very interesting in hemp is that not too many people reference the cannabis industry. Hemp and cannabis are very similar plants. Matthew and I come from a very interesting perspective where we know the cannabis industry. We're familiar with the plants. We know what the plants like. We know what the plants don't like. And coming into this hemp space is really interesting because these are a lot more corn farmers, soybean farmers who don't necessarily have the cannabis experience of dealing with those plants specifically. So I recommend kind of a merging of the pharmaceutical industry and then the cannabis industry, something as simple as, topping your plants, trying to create that nice even canopy. In hemp, we don't do that. It's too large of a scale to manually mess with your plants like that, or even growing on a rotation. I tell people all the time, if you live in a place where the weather cooperates, somewhere like, say, Florida, California, maybe even parts of Arizona and Texas, grow on a rotation. That's what we do in cannabis. We don't deal with all, 2.75 acres at one time. We do with little chunks every 2 weeks. So I recommend, if you've got the growing space or the growing season, to definitely look into doing it on a rotation. That way you're not dealing with, say, 100 acres that are screaming to be harvested. You're dealing with like 10 or 15, which is a lot more manageable. So do it in bite-sized chunks. Again, if you can, somewhere like Illinois, maybe not as possible. When the winter comes, it's here. You know what I mean? So somewhere that has a little bit more forgiving growing seasons, I would recommend adopting some of those cannabis practices.
That's great. So definition alert, Shawna, topping. What does that mean for those of us that are not cultivators?
That's a great point. So topping is basically snipping the tops of your plants. A plant likes to grow straight up, but if you snip the top, it tells it, let's grow a couple. So it actually fills out your canopy by topping your plants. You have a couple different top colas as opposed to just that one lollipop or toothpick plant. You trick your plant into spitting out a couple different colas, which increases your canopy and then increases your overall yields as well too, because your plant is focusing on spitting out nugs as opposed to building thicker stalks. So just some of those more cannabis practices I'd love to see implemented in hemp within reason. It may not make sense to top 150 acres at once or something like that.
Do it with a tractor. Excuse me. Well, yeah, I think that's the thing, is that, it's still tough to get really good information as you're trying to get into the industry. I think it can be a challenge. And so, you're doing your best guesses, but really do try to do a lot of due diligence. And, a lot of folks, it's been my experience in this industry that the cultivation side gets a lot of attention because we love the plant and it's fun to participate in that part. But in the grand scheme of this industry, that's the easiest part. And so what I see businesses struggle with all the time is, okay, I grew it, now how do I sell it all in a way that actually brings in more money than what it costs me to grow it? And so, it's definitely an industry driven by people that have a huge passion for what they're doing. But it's becoming more and more important that you also have a solid business behind that. And so you need to think about, your distribution, who you're going to sell to, your branding, what's going to differentiate yourself from other people in what is becoming a more and more crowded market. So it's just the more forward thinking. And I tell people these days, really think about hemp because of the benefits that Shawna mentioned, organic, regulations on pesticides, a lot of things that cannabis doesn't enjoy. That can be your entryway into this world, because the THC barrier that's really the difference between cannabis and hemp right now, that's a law, and a law that most likely will evolve over time. And so understanding that, there's a way to get into this in a totally legal way right now, and wait for some of that, more adult use side. Because compared to the adult use market, hemp doesn't hardly have any rules, So like we said, do a lot of due diligence, but really focus on making sure that you don't get so caught up in the growing fun that you forget you have to sell it.
Well, and it makes perfect sense, because at the end of the day, all of these processes, they're not free. And so we have to look at how are we going to generate an ROI on the capital spent and invested into these processes. And so, Tim, I would like to go back to you and kind of say, how do we generate an ROI, and what types of things do we need to be looking at from a business model perspective?
Sure. And so one of the things that there's market forces in terms of spot pricing, right? And I think we all are maybe painfully aware, right, that pricing had been at the high of $4, now down to maybe less than $1 over the last 6 to 12 months, which is challenging, right? So how do you actually project revenue when you have a fluctuating market? Well, you control the influencers and variables as much as possible. And that goes to how much you're going to plant, but to complement what Shawna and Matthew said, who are your end buyers before you plant? So you have as much as you can, a consistent production with a capacity for the market that will absorb what you're actually producing as much as you can, right? The other component is making those right and thoughtful decisions, right? So we developed what we call a centers of excellence model. And that's bringing underneath the canopy or the roof all these moving parts that influence from seed to harvest to drying to post-harvest processing, and bringing all those disciplines, right, underneath that one roof, and sometimes virtually, where we've developed a strategic partnership alliance with many of these entities that help fill in the gaps, right, to make these thoughtful decisions. So those are things you can actually influence and control. The spot pricing in the marketplace, that's based upon supply and demand, which is very, very difficult. The other piece is that when and where possible, lean on your fellow farmers, right? Your colleagues. So let's say you can't make that capital investment of the dryer. That's okay, right? That's okay. Now let's build that bridge to another area in that given geography to have them toll dry, but have that contract to do that drying before you plant, right?
That makes perfect sense. And you alluded to that earlier in our segment about co-ops. And it seems to me like that could be a really powerful solution to overcoming the capital investment needed for some of these processes.
Correct. And as we think about the grain model, where you have the grain silos every, let's say, 20, 30 miles down the highway, where you look over at the side of the road, you see these monster facilities. I think that's a model that, from a co-op perspective, is going to be growing in value and prominence in the marketplace. In addition to that, we see, life beyond CBD, right? We see entries in the marketplace for industrial use of hemp. And albeit that it's not a marketplace product today, they're burgeoning very, very quickly in the clothing industry, the automobile industry. So that brings in more well-financed players, if you will, to the marketplace. But again, it also increases drying capacity. And that's the area that we're trying to get our arms around and be good stewards to in the industry.
That's perfect. And this is so amazing. I have to thank all three of you for joining WeedBudz Radio, because for me, when Tim and I connected, we started kind of brainstorming, how do we educate people about
Sure.
where drying fits and how to make it affordable? Because, this really is about supporting farmers at the end of the day. And so if we can inspire either entrepreneurs or farmers out there to come together and create some of these co-op models, I think we can see some just more and higher quality product in the marketplace. And so at WeedBudz, we try to be kind of thought leaders and inspirers of some of these different things. And so, Tim, if I'm a farmer, I know that I need this in my life. And I found three experts here that are more than just selling me a drying system. I mean, Shawna clearly, just sleeps, breathes, and eats this knowledge. And so, and having the three of you, be more than just here's a dryer. Here's a dryer, but these are real business partners. And so, Tim, if I'm looking to either create a co-op or I'm looking to establish a drying business and acquire a dryer, what's the best way for me to reach out and start engaging with you and your team?
I think probably the best way to triage those inquiries is info@iecompanies.com. If we keep it very straight and forward, info@iecompanies.com. And the IE stands for innovative and environmental. So we're friendly to the environment. We like to be respectful to those really thoughtful considerations, because we are a reflection of an industry that's growing and burgeoning. So info@iecompanies.com.
Well, an environment is something that's near and dear to our heart as well. I mean, today's episode presented by Not Plastic. And so, for me, when I started Not Plastic, it really is about looking at the environment, but it's also looking at people. What are the human costs of plastic and our production to the world? And so we really are all about kind of inspiring these forward-thinking companies to come together and provide solutions. And I just am so grateful to have met the three of you. Thank you so much for joining. And we will drop some links in our show notes. And so that way it'd be very easy for our listeners to reach out to any of the three of you. And figure out how we bring drying a little bit more local. So thanks again, everybody, and we'll talk again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rye.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Rye.
Have a great day. Thank you.
Bye-bye now.